Outsmarting and avoidant is not what most people think it is. It is not the deployment of superior psychological strategy, not the calculated application of attachment theory to produce a specific behavioral response, not the deliberate withholding of availability timed to activate the precise neurological conditions that make avoidant desire peak. None of the chess game framing that the word outsmart suggests. What it actually is, the thing that genuinely surprises an avoidant, that genuinely disrupts the comfortable configuration they were running, that they genuinely did not anticipate, is something considerably more ordinary and considerably more powerful than any strategy. It is simply becoming yourself, genuinely, completely, without the specific accommodations and calibrations and pre-qualifications that the dynamic was requiring, without the managed version of yourself that the relationship's conditions had been producing, without the organizing of your emotional life around the monitoring of their patterns. That is what they did not expect, not a countermove. You, fully present in your own life, with your own clear perception, with your own honest standards held without apology. The version of yourself that exists when you stop trying to fit the available container and start living from your own genuine center. This surprises avoidance in a specific way that deserves honest examination, because understanding why it surprises them illuminates both their psychology and something important about yours. The avoidance comfortable configuration was always built on a specific assumption about you, not a conscious assumption, a functional one, built from the evidence of the dynamic's operation. The assumption that the dynamic had successfully established itself on terms that would sustain, that the managed distance was being received as simply the texture of the relationship rather than as the pattern it was, that the calibration of your responses to their emotional climate was settled enough to be depended upon. The assumption, in other words, that you would continue to show up in the form the dynamic required, reaching after withdrawals, softening after coldness, staying available after insufficiency. Being the consistent, generous, always there presence that the comfortable configuration was quietly running on, this assumption was not unreasonable given the evidence. You had provided that evidence consistently. The dynamic had been producing its characteristic pattern, and you had been absorbing the characteristic pattern with the characteristic generosity. The model had been confirmed repeatedly. What the model did not account for was the possibility that the confirming would stop. Not because you decided to stop confirming it as a strategic move, because you genuinely arrived somewhere different, because the accumulation of honest seeing and honest cost and honest assessment finally produced the shift that accumulations eventually produce. Because the person who had been absorbing the pattern was also, underneath the absorbing, becoming clearer about what the pattern was and what it was costing and what continuing to confirm it was producing. The genuine shift, not the performed shift, not the strategic withdrawal, not the deliberate withholding designed to activate desire, is what the model had no adequate response to. Because the model was built to handle the other person's pursuing behavior, their emotional expressions, their patience, their hope, the model was not built to handle the other person simply becoming themselves. What does becoming yourself actually look like in practice? What are the specific, observable daily life changes that constitute the thing the avoidant did not expect? The first is the change in what you respond to and how. During the dynamic, the pattern of response was organized around the avoidant's emotional climate. When they were warm, the response was open. When they withdrew, the response was the pursuing or the patient waiting or the careful management of your own reactions to avoid activating further withdrawal. The responses were calibrated to them, were secondary to their primary movement. When you become yourself genuinely, the calibration changes. The responses become organized around your own genuine experience rather than around the avoidance climate. When something is working well, you are genuinely present for it. When something is not working well, you respond from your own honest assessment of that, rather than from the strategic calculation of how to respond without destabilizing the configuration. The response is primary rather than secondary, yours rather than managed. The avoidance nervous system, which is exquisitely attuned to the relational atmosphere, registers this immediately. The quality of your responses is different, less organized around managing the dynamic's temperature, more genuinely expressive of your actual experience. The specific, subtle, difficult-to-name quality of someone who is responding from their own center, rather than from the managed uncertainty of someone whose center has been displaced by the dynamic. The second change is in the quality of your standards, not declared standards, lived ones, The specific behavioral non-negotiable minimum of what you will and will not continue to engage with, becoming visible not through announcement, but through action. During the dynamic, the standards that were communicated, the honest naming of what the pattern was costing, the clear expression of what was needed, were often received and managed rather than genuinely heard. Managed because the standards, however clearly expressed, were not being backed by the behavioral reality of someone who would actually act on them. The words described the minimum. The continued availability, regardless of whether the minimum was met, made the words negotiable. When you become yourself genuinely, the standards stop being negotiable in the specific practical sense that the continued availability is no longer unconditional. Not because you announce the change, because the lived reality of your engagement reflects it. The reaching that used to follow withdrawals stops following as automatically. The softening that used to follow coldness stops being as reliably available. The space that used to be filled by your investment is not being filled. The avoidant encounters this as the specific surprising quality of their usual moves not producing the usual results. Not because you have learned counter moves. Because the architecture of the dynamic has changed. The responses it was built to produce are no longer being consistently provided. The third change is in the clarity of your perception and the willingness to trust it. During the dynamic, the accurate perception was there. The knowing that something was off, that the pattern was a pattern, that the management strategies were management strategies, all of that was generating continuously, and it was being managed into the territory of uncertainty. Second guessed, qualified back into ambiguity, kept at the level of something feels wrong, rather than allowed to become, I understand exactly what is happening here. When you become yourself genuinely, the perception stops being managed into uncertainty. The clear knowing is trusted rather than qualified. The accurate read is the operative read rather than the provisional, always subject to revision read that the dynamic was producing. This change in the quality of your perception is one of the most specifically unsettling things the avoidant encounters, because the comfortable configuration was always partly dependent on the asymmetry of clarity, on the other person's accurate perception being kept uncertain enough that the management strategies could continue to function as designed. When the perception is clear and trusted and operative, the management strategies encounter a fundamentally different kind of engagement, one that sees what they are doing without requiring the seeing to be demonstrated or announced, simply knowing, and responding from the knowing. The fourth change is the one that tends to produce the most visible disruption in the avoidance comfortable configuration. It is the change in what your attention is primarily organized around. During the dynamic, your primary attention was organized around the dynamic, around the avoidance patterns and what they meant and how to respond to them and whether things were okay and what was happening and what came next. The dynamic was the foreground and your own life was the background. When you become yourself genuinely, this inverts. Your life is the foreground. The dynamic, if it continues to be part of your life at all, is one element of a life that has other genuine elements, receiving genuine investment. The avoidant is not the primary variable of your emotional life. Your own genuine projects, relationships, interests, and developing sense of what matters are. The avoidance nervous system registers this change in the specific destabilizing way of something that was depended upon as the organizing center of the other person's attention no longer being that center. The specific searching, where has the attention gone quality of someone whose comfortable configuration was running on the other person's primary focus and is encountering a genuinely different focus. This is not a strategy. You are not performing disinterest. You are genuinely interested in your own life. And the genuine interest in your own life changes the dynamics conditions more fundamentally than any performed version of the same could. Here is where this conversation needs to step back from the framing and say something honest about what the word outsmart was always pointing toward and what it actually means. The framing of outsmarting and avoidant positions the dynamic as a contest, as something to be won through superior strategy or intelligence or psychological sophistication. This framing is understandable. The dynamic does sometimes feel like a contest, like there is a game being played and one side keeps losing because they are not seeing the rules clearly enough. But the framing is not quite accurate, and accepting it uncritically leads somewhere that is not fully honest. What actually happens when someone in a dynamic with an avoidant genuinely becomes themselves? When the calibration to the avoidance climate stops, when the standards are lived rather than just communicated, when the clear perception is trusted, when the genuine life becomes the foreground, is not that they outsmarted the avoidant, It is that they stopped participating in the specific configuration that the dynamic required. And the stopping is not a victory over the avoidant. It is a return to themselves. A recovery of what the dynamic was consuming. A coming back to the person who existed before the organizing of emotional life around someone else's patterns. That is not outsmarting, that is recovering. The difference matters because outsmarting is still organized around the avoidant. Still about what happens to them as a result of your move. Still measuring success by their response. The recovering is organized around you, around what becomes possible in your own life when the primary investment shifts back to its actual home. The avoidance response to the recovering, the disruption of the comfortable configuration, the surprise that the model was wrong, the specific discomfort of the asymmetry being removed, is a byproduct of the recovering, not its goal, not its measure. The byproduct. The avoidant genuinely did not expect this. That part is true and worth holding clearly because it illuminates something real about the dynamic's assumptions. They did not expect the clarity to become operative, did not expect the standards to be lived rather than just communicated, did not expect the attention to genuinely shift, did not expect the model's predictions to stop being confirmed by your behavior, and the reason they did not expect it is specific. The history of the dynamic had provided consistent evidence in one direction. The evidence said you would continue absorbing, would continue reaching, would continue organizing the primary investment of your attention around the dynamic's requirements. The evidence was not unreasonable. It was what the dynamic had been producing. What the avoidant did not account for, because it is genuinely difficult to account for from inside a comfortable configuration, is the specific, human, entirely predictable result of sustained honest assessment of an insufficient dynamic. Which is that the assessment eventually produces its honest conclusion. That the accumulation of evidence about what the dynamic is and what it costs and what it is not providing eventually reaches the level where the conclusion it has always been pointing towards becomes undeniable and actionable. The avoidant was not accounting for you finishing your process, for the honest assessment completing itself, for the person who was absorbing and assessing to arrive at the place the assessment was always building toward. That is what they did not expect. Not a strategic countermove, the completion of your own honest process. The completion of your own honest process is the most genuinely powerful thing available in this landscape. More powerful than any strategy, more disruptive to comfortable configurations than any countermove, more genuinely significant for your own life than any technique. Because it is real, it cannot be weighted out the way a strategy can be weighted out, cannot be managed around the way performed behavior can be managed around, cannot be handled by the deployment of the next available management tool, the way a temporary disruption can be handled. The completion of your own honest process is the specific, permanent, entirely genuine shift of someone who has arrived somewhere through the real accumulation of real experience and real assessment. Who is now, from that arrived somewhere, a different kind of participant in any dynamic they inhabit, not a more strategic one, a more genuinely themselves one. The avoidant did not expect that. And the honest truth is that it was never primarily about them. The completing of your own honest process was always primarily about you. About the return to yourself that the dynamic was always making necessary by requiring the departure from yourself in the first place. The return is the thing, not the effect on the avoidant, not the disruption of the comfortable configuration, not the surprise that the model was wrong. The return to yourself. That is what was always worth finding. That is what was always the point. The return to yourself is not a single event. This has been said in various forms throughout this conversation. And it is worth saying again with the specific, practical honesty it deserves. Because the framing of returning to yourself can accumulate into something that sounds more complete and more arrived at than the actual daily experience of it tends to feel. The actual daily experience tends to feel like ordinary life, not the elevated, everything is clearer now quality of someone who has achieved a significant insight and is living from the stable ground of that insight permanently. The ordinary, specific, sometimes difficult, sometimes genuinely good quality of a person who is making choices day by day from a clearer position than they were making them before. Some of those days, the clearer position is genuinely available, and the choices that come from it feel natural and grounded and right. Some of those days, the old pull is present, the pull toward the monitoring, the pull toward the managed uncertainty, the pull toward organizing the day's emotional quality around someone else's patterns, and the clearer position requires the specific, patient, daily choosing to stay in rather than the automatic inhabiting of it. This is what genuine change actually looks like from the inside. Not the clean, settled, arrived quality of the narrative, but the daily, imperfect, sometimes effortful reality of someone who has understood something clearly and is working to live from the understanding rather than simply possessing it. What the avoidant did not expect, specifically, was the combination. Not just the clarity of perception, not just the lived standards, not just the shift in where the primary attention goes. The combination of all of those things happening genuinely and simultaneously in a person who was previously organized in a very different direction. The combination is harder to manage around than any single element. A single change can be accommodated by the deployment of the right management strategy. The clarity of perception can be addressed by the increased vulnerability deployment. The lived standards can be managed by the strategic warmth that restores the investment. The shifted attention can be addressed by the increased engagement that pulls the attention back. But when all of these things are happening together, when they are happening because they are all expressions of the same genuine underlying shift rather than separate tactical changes, the management strategies encounter something that cannot be addressed, one element at a time. The genuine shift is not a collection of individual behaviors that can each be responded to with the corresponding management tool. It is a different person occupying the same role in the dynamic. A person whose fundamental orientation has changed in a way that makes the specific dynamic that the management strategies were designed to operate within no longer fully available. This is what genuinely surprises avoidance. Not the specific behaviors, but the wholeness. The specific, recognizable, cannot be managed around quality of someone who has returned to themselves as a whole person rather than as a collection of behaviors that can be individually addressed. There is something worth examining about what happened to you during the dynamic that makes the return to yourself a more specific and more significant thing than the language of returning to yourself might suggest. The dynamic was not neutral in its effects on who you were while you were in it. The specific, characteristic demands of avoidant dynamics, the calibration of your responses to the avoidance climate, the pre-qualification of legitimate need, the management of your own honest perception toward uncertainty, the organizing of significant emotional bandwidth around the monitoring of someone else's patterns, these things have a shaping effect. They produce a version of you that is somewhat different from the version that exists when those demands are not present. The shaped version is smaller in specific ways, not smaller in the dramatic, obvious sense of someone who has been obviously diminished. Smaller in the quieter, more specific ways of someone who has been making ongoing accommodations that add up, who has been qualifying honest observations before communicating them, who has been reaching for explanations that soften the accurate assessment, who has been tolerating a gap between what is needed and what is available as simply the texture of the relationship, rather than as the specific nameable, addressable insufficiency it actually is. The return to yourself is the recovery of what was being shaped away, not the recovery of some idealized pre-dynamic self that existed in a purer form before the experience. The recovery of the specific things the dynamic was requiring to be set aside. The direct expression of honest perception without the pre-qualification. The legitimate need without the apology. The honest assessment without the softening toward whatever framing makes it most compatible with the continuation of the comfortable configuration. These recoveries are specific. They are not abstract. And they constitute genuine change in the person who returns to themselves, rather than simply a change in strategic position within the same dynamic. The avoidant surprise at the combination of genuine changes deserves more examination because the surprise itself is revealing. The surprise is possible because the avoidance model of you was built from a specific and limited dataset. The dataset of you inside the dynamic, of you calibrating and accommodating and reaching and managing, of you as the specifically shaped version that the dynamics demands were producing. The model built from that dataset was accurate as a description of the shaped version. It was not accurate as a description of who you actually are when the shaping demands are not present. The model confused the shaped version for the whole person. This is one of the more illuminating aspects of what happens when you genuinely return to yourself in the context of an avoidant dynamic. The avoidant surprise is, in a specific sense, the surprise of encountering more of you than the model had accounted for. The parts of you that the dynamic was requiring to be managed at a lower level. The specific capacities and qualities and genuine dimensions of who you are that were not available in their full expression within the shape the dynamic was producing. The full version of you, not enhanced, not different, simply less constrained by the dynamic's specific demands, is genuinely different from the shaped version. and encountering the full version after the model was built on the shaped version produces the specific disruption of someone whose accurate read of the situation has been revised by new data. The new data is you, without the shape. What this means practically for the forward-facing part of your life is worth being specific about rather than leaving at the level of general encouragement. The return to yourself that happens in the context of genuinely moving through and past an avoidant dynamic is not just about that specific dynamic. It is the recovery of a way of being in relationships generally that the dynamic was working against. The direct perception without the pre-qualification. The lived standards without the indefinite patience that keeps the standards from being behaviorally real. The primary investment in your own genuine life rather than in the monitoring of someone else's patterns. These recovered capacities are available in every subsequent context, not just in future relationships with avoidance. In professional contexts, where the ability to perceive clearly and respond from genuine assessment rather than from managed uncertainty is genuinely differentiating. In friendships where the ability to maintain honest standards without the indefinite absorbing of imbalance produces more genuinely nourishing relationships. In your relationship with yourself, where the direct, non-pre-qualified honest assessment of your own situation produces better decisions and more genuine self-knowledge, the dynamic was a specific and costly context in which something genuinely useful was built. The specific, practical, daily life relevant capacities that the dynamic built by requiring them to be recovered are not limited in their application to the context that required them. There is something specifically worth addressing about the intelligence that the word outsmart was pointing toward, because it is real and it deserves honest acknowledgement beyond the reframing of the word. What you demonstrated in the course of the dynamic, in the sustained, honest, often painful process of seeing clearly and eventually acting on what the clear seeing showed, is a form of intelligence that is genuinely significant. Not the intelligence of superior information processing speed or academic knowledge or strategic sophistication. The specific, demanding, relatively rare intelligence of being able to hold a complicated situation honestly over an extended period of time, without the complexity resolving into either the comfortable simplification of denial or the premature resolution of protective cynicism. Holding the full picture, the genuine feeling and the genuine cost, the real connection and the real insufficiency, the avoidance, genuine psychology, and your genuine needs. Without collapsing any of it into something more manageable, requires a specific quality of intelligence that is not common and that is not easy. It requires the specific cognitive and emotional capacity to sustain genuine ambiguity without the ambiguity producing either hopeless paralysis or the false resolution of premature conclusions. You sustained that over a period of time that was probably longer than was comfortable, in conditions that were consistently producing pressure toward one simplified resolution or another. With the ongoing, honest, effortful maintenance of the full complicated picture rather than the comfortable version. That is genuine intelligence, not the outsmarting of a specific person, the intelligent navigation of a genuinely complex situation that many people resolve much earlier through one of the available simplifications. Your willingness and capacity to stay with the full complexity until the honest assessment was genuinely complete is something worth acknowledging clearly rather than burying in the narrative of the dynamic's consequences. The avoidance surprise has a timeline. It does not arrive all at once, and it does not stay at the same level of intensity. Understanding the timeline is practically useful. The first phase of the surprise is the disruption of the prediction. The model said you would do something specific in response to the latest expression of the pattern. The something specific did not happen. The prediction failed. The first phase is primarily cognitive, the updating of the model to account for the new data. The management strategies search for the appropriate response to the new configuration. The second phase, if the genuine shift is sustained, is the escalation of the disruption into something more significant than the model updating of the first phase. The management strategies that were found in the first phase are deployed. They encounter a different quality of reception than they were designed for. The increased vulnerability deployment does not produce the full configuration restoring warmth. The warmth when departure threatens does not produce the full return of predictable investment. The usual tools are not working with their usual efficiency. The second phase is where the avoidance experience becomes genuinely uncomfortable in ways that the first phase did not require. The model is not just updating. The comfortable configuration is not being restored. The management strategies are encountering something they cannot adequately manage. The third phase is where the significant stuff happens, or fails to happen, where the genuine disruption either produces the genuine confrontation with the self that the disruption was pointing toward, or is successfully managed back to a tolerable level through sufficient time and the discovery of a strategy that finally does restore enough of the comfortable configuration to reduce the urgency of the confrontation. Both outcomes of the third phase are possible. Both are outside your control. The genuine shift you made created the conditions for the third phase. What the avoidant does with the third phase is entirely theirs. Here is the most honest thing this conversation can say about the outsmarting framing and what it was always really asking. The person who asked the question implicit in this conversation, how do I stop losing in this dynamic, was asking something real and important. The experience of avoidant dynamics genuinely feels like losing, like being consistently outmaneuvered, like the other person's management of the dynamic being more sophisticated than your navigation of it, like your genuine caring and genuine investment consistently producing results that feel like defeat. The honest answer to the question is not a strategy for winning. It is the reframing of the game itself. You were not losing a game of strategy, you were absorbing the cost of a dynamic that was running at your expense. The thing that looks like being outmaneuvered is not actually superior avoidance strategy. It is the specific, automatic, below-conscious operation of a defensive architecture that runs efficiently because it has been running for a very long time and is highly practiced. The answer to it is not to become more strategically sophisticated within the same game. The answer is to recognize that the game is not worth playing, that the specific configuration the dynamic was requiring, you absorbing, reaching, calibrating, managing, was producing a dynamic that served the comfortable configuration rather than serving either person's genuine needs. The exit from that configuration is not the superior countermove. It is the genuine, honest, entirely real recognition that the configuration was never the right game in the first place. And that recognition lived rather than performed. That is what they did not expect. Not because you became smarter than them, because you became more honest than the dynamic required you to be. More honest about what was happening. More honest about what it was costing. More honest about what you actually needed. More honest about the gap between what was needed and what was available. And finally, most importantly, honest enough to act on the honest assessment rather than continuing to defer the action in the hope that the assessment would eventually produce a different conclusion. The honesty was always available to you, was always generating the accurate read, was always pointing toward its honest conclusion. The only thing that changed was your willingness to let it be what it was. That is the intelligence the word outsmart was always pointing toward, not the outmaneuvering of another person, the willingness to be fully honest with yourself. That is harder than any strategy, rarer than any countermove, and more genuinely powerful than anything else available in this landscape. You were not outmaneuvered during the dynamic because you were less intelligent. You were absorbing the cost of genuine caring in a configuration that was not adequately honoring it. The intelligence was always there. The honesty to act on it fully was what finally changed. And that change, quiet, unglamorous, genuinely yours, is the thing they did not expect, because it was never about them. It was always about you. Finally, completely, honestly you.